The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight, and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. Rin Yamaoka, aka The Spirit. Before the inclusion of this character, I assumed that killers were, well, killers. Rin Yamaoka marks the first killer who hasn't actually killed anyone. At least that's how most interpretations go. The Spirit is also the first killer from Japan, and supposedly stands in for Behaviour's take on the J-horror genre. Time-wise, we're still in the 20th century, but the latter half or even early 21st century. Coming from a privileged background, Rin was an otherwise normal Japanese student at a private university, but there was trouble at home. Her mother had fallen ill and her father, who had been declining for quite a while now, had been unfairly fired from his job. This proved to be the tipping point for the Yamaoka patriarch, and one day Rin came home from her simple restaurant shift to find her father slicing up her mother with a katana. The father then turned his attention to his daughter and cut her as well, throwing her through a partition and slicing off a limb or two. As Rin lay dying, she cursed her father in an intense rage, and the entity itself promised her revenge. Rin's story reminds me of the Hag, besides also making her a killer who is most definitely dead by the time of her inclusion into the entity's realm. The lore has a similar Faustian feeling of someone who sells their soul for vengeance. It isn't explicitly stated that Rin got to kill her father after the deal was struck, but some fans assume she at least got that. I don't know for sure. What is clear is her rage and her anger, which mysteriously caused the entity to recruit her. Just how angry does one have to be to impress an immortal evil demigod despite having a body count of 0? Her tome also shows her inner wrath, primarily focusing on her high school years where she learns kendo to honour her samurai legacy and placate her father, who even back then was coming undone, but Rin was dedicated to her family. Rin also suffered bullying during this time from classist classmates who'd compare her to a janitor. The bullying escalated and turns to physical violence, to which she responds in equal term. At several points, she surprises herself at the darkness of her thoughts, before realising how much she actually likes it, and then she puts those bullies in their place. Being the victim of bullying was surprisingly not very well represented in the project. Rin's anger has been passed down the generations. In one of my favourite lore moments, we hear the iconic roar of the Oni before Rin goes beast mode. Presumably her father had that same instinct. It's heavily implied that the entity was the one tormenting him in the first place, and is actually the true culprit of the murder of Mrs. Yamaoka. The father was supposed to be the killer chosen, but the daughter got the job instead. The ultimate implication being that Rin is now working for the very being that's responsible for her suffering in the first place. It reminds me of the story of Scorpion from the Mortal Kombat series. A desire for vengeance against the wrong but still likely target at the hands of those who truly wronged you. But in terms of my own project, this is another killer I don't have much to say about. Of course Rin Yamaoka doesn't compare to any of the 100 cases, but I do wonder if the nature of her ancestral wrath has some basis in mental health. Anger is prominent in secondary psychopathy, but I don't see any of the other telltale signs. She doesn't strike me as impulsive, contumacious, disempathic, or anything like that. This kind of anger may or may not be present in Factor 1 psychopathy, but it's a very goal-oriented kind of anger. Survivors say that when that mask falls, and they see the psychopath for what he really is, it's beyond horrifying. However, Factor 1 psychopathy is also associated with shallow affect and emotional flatness. I want a quick moment to praise Spirit's visual design. I could have gushed over any of the killers so far if I'm being honest, but this entry is a real standout. She looks and feels and is amazing. Looking at Spirit's animation, she seems to fluctuate wildly between sorrow and crazy, between despair and frenzy, between mania and depression, manic depression, bipolar disorder. Could it be the Yamaoka curse is simply a very potent variant of bipolar disorder? I don't think so, actually. The mood swings of someone with bipolar disorder can last a very long time, sometimes months, not a few seconds as depicted here. Bipolar disorder showed up a bit during the course of the project with Bonin, Hansen, and Ted Bundy, who is a notorious example. But unlike ASPD, bipolar disorder wasn't overrepresented amongst serial murderers. However, bipolar disorder is often confused with another cluster B pathology, borderline personality disorder. There are similar mood swings coupled with intense anger, amongst other symptoms such as abandonment anxiety and, again, impulsivity. But Spirit doesn't seem to exhibit these traits. Furthermore, she lacks the long-standing victim of abuse we'd see with someone with borderline personality disorder. Finally, even the agonizing emotional dysregulation of BPD doesn't account for this presentation. I could simply stop here and accept I'm reading far, far too much into a fictional character, or I could not do that and instead just assume she has both. I've always wondered what multiple mood disorders in the same person would look like, and now I know. God, I'm such a genius.
Sometimes my genius, it generates gravity.
Okay, I feel the need to reiterate I'm not a mental health professional in any capacity whatsoever, and I'm being facetious, but surely you can see my point of view, yes? BPD also showed up during the course of my project, being about as well represented as narcissistic personality disorder, and was present in Warnos, Danny Rolling, Larry Eiler, and a few others. Either way, Rin doesn't have much basis in true crime, but her father most definitely does. Given Mr. Yamaoka was likely the entity's original candidate for the trials, it's with him I look at real-world comparisons. A father who killed his wife and daughter. It definitely happens. A lot. Have you ever heard of the Ballad of Hollis Brown? Chris Watts is probably the most notorious recent example. He murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters for reasons I'm still not entirely clear on. In Ireland, Alan Hoare murdered his wife and 3 sons before killing himself. John List is another example. He killed his wife, 3 children, and his own mother. That truly is a shattered bloodline. List got away with it for a long time, having started a new life before being arrested. Unfortunately, there are many stories like this, and I don't know which, if any, served as an inspiration for Rin and her family. You are indeed more likely to be killed by someone you know rather than a stranger, especially a serial killer, with serial murder accounting for 1% of all homicides. Real-life horror is much more mundane. But in a surprise twist, few serial killers targeted their significant others or their own children. I've mentioned Terence Rasmussen a few times now, a Bluebeard-style killer that killed his wife, possibly wives, and his children, but that's actually quite rare. These men often love their partners and give a convincing facade of being a normal family man. There are certainly exceptions, from Black Widows to Bluebeards to evil parents, but there are more examples of serial killers seeing immediate family as a morality pet, even having their own twisted idea of love. This is an avenue that I still struggle to understand, but I guess even evil has loved ones. But I guess not in this case. The spirit's special power has been tweaked many times over the years, but in almost every iteration it sees this killer alongside the nurse as an S-tier opponent. Good mobility, good mind games, or guessing games if you like. And a really rather elegant and smooth way to dispatch enemies with, let's be honest, minimal skill, at least at the entry level. To jump ahead, this is actually the last time borderline personality disorder will be brought up. I know some people suspect Skull Merchant suffers from this disorder, but I disagree. I'll tell you why later. I do think Amanda Young qualifies, but with her callous attitude and criminal aggression, I'd bet on her being a BPD, a SPD comorbid. But the pick doesn't get an entry. I've always found her very easy to play and got decent results. I do agree some of her add-ons were absolutely broken and some are still very strong additions. But I like a killer that has an interesting and robust loadout, one that has lots of options. It makes the planning stage before the fight all the juicier. I wish I'd been a more active participant in studying Rin when she first came out, but at around this time I was poring over the DBD wiki and watching dozens of perk videos, and I didn't really pay much attention to the most recent addition to the killer roster. It makes me wonder what a new player will have to learn coming into the game now. As is, if I had to pick a favourite killer, it just might be the Spirit. She's certainly the one I've played as the most, which is saying something. Being competitive and fun will certainly be a boost to your playtime, and many other players agree. As I close out, I want to mention that the name Yamaoka is the surname of Akira Yamaoka, who composed many of the Silent Hill music scores, a good nod of respect to someone very important in survival horror. He'd composed the music for Dead by Daylight's Silent Hill chapter a few years later. At least that's one bloodline that's clean.